The morning light cut through the dusty windows of the diner, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. In a corner booth sat a frail old man, his hands steady on his coffee mug. He was trying to ignore the loud laughter from the group of bikers at the counter. Their conversation was boisterous, filled with crude jokes and the occasional slamming of mugs onto the counter. The noise didn't seem to bother him. He had been through much worse, much louder. Then, without warning, one of them stood, shoved his chair back, and growled, "Get out of my way, old man." The words were thick with menace, dripping with contempt. The man shoved Walter's table, sending the cup of coffee tumbling. It splashed onto his shirt, scalding him slightly, but the old man didn't flinch. He simply stared at the rising stain on his once white shirt. The biker's sneer widened as he slapped Walter across the face, the crack of flesh on flesh ringing out. The room froze. A sharp intake of breath echoed across the diner. The laughter stopped. A glass shattered, the sound of it like distant gunfire. The old man staggered, but his hands shot out to steady himself on the edge of the table. His cheek turned red, a welt rising where the biker's hand had struck. The biker sneered again, savoring the moment of power. Walter, though, didn't say a word. He didn't even acknowledge the pain. With quiet dignity, he reached for the cap resting on the corner of the table. He placed it back on his head, the 101st Airborne insignia catching the morning light. With deliberate calm, he returned to his seat, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. The laughter from the group of bikers resumed, though this time it sounded hollow, empty, like the laughter of men who knew nothing of respect, of honor. This wasn't just any old man. This was Walter Briggs. His past wasn't easily seen, tucked under the faded fabric of his uniform cap. He had lived a life few could imagine, one of grit, sacrifice, and loss. And though he now sat in this diner, sipping his coffee, the weight of his memories was carried in every line on his face, every tremble in his hand. The quiet dignity he wore wasn't something you saw at first glance, it was earned through decades of hardship. Walter had fought in the Korean War, jumping from helicopters into enemy territory, knowing each descent could be his last. He had been a part of the 101st Airborne, the storied, screaming Eagles. He didn't talk much about the war. To him, the details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the brotherhood, the men he fought beside, the lives they shared, the memories they made in the heat of battle. He had saved lives under fire, carried comrades who were heavier than any burden, all while keeping his own life in constant jeopardy. His hands, now weathered by age, had once been steady, strong, gripping rifles, pulling levers, guiding fellow soldiers to safety. They had once been tools of survival in a world gone mad with violence. But now, they trembled slightly when he held his coffee mug, not because of age, but because of the weight of the years. He had lived through battles no man should endure and come out the other side with only scars, scars both seen and unseen. The cap Walter wore was more than just a piece of fabric. It was a symbol. To the world, it said he was a veteran, someone who had served in a war long forgotten by those who hadn't fought in it. But to him, it was a reminder of the 101st Airborne Division, of the brothers he had lost along the way, of the memories that clung to him like a second skin. But perhaps more than anything, that cap was a legacy. It was a promise to his son, Commander James Briggs, that the sacrifices of the past weren't in vain. James had followed his father into service, though he had seen a different kind of battle, one far from the jungles of Korea but equally as difficult. Walter had watched his son grow into a man of honor, and it had filled him with pride, even as it broke his heart to see that his own sacrifices seemed to mean little to the world now. Walter didn't talk about his past much. It was too painful. The loss of friends, the weight of things unsaid, the feeling of being forgotten. The world had moved on, leaving men like him behind, their sacrifices slipping from the collective memory. But he kept wearing the cap, kept showing up at this diner every Sunday. It was the only place he felt connected to something, anything. The diner had become his refuge, his way of holding on to a past that seemed so distant now. It was a place where, for a few hours, he could pretend that time hadn't slipped away. Every Sunday, he sat in the same booth, waiting for his son to join him. It was a small tradition, a quiet one. But it meant everything. It was his only link to a world that seemed to be vanishing, to a time when he had been more than just a forgotten veteran. He had been a soldier. A father. A man who had given everything for a country that had long since stopped caring. His son was the only family he had left, and the moments they shared were all that anchored him. The rest of the world could forget him. But as long as he had his son, Walter could hold on to something that had meaning. Though Walter had returned home decades ago, the country's gratitude had long since faded. He had fought valiantly in a war that most had forgotten, his sacrifices overlooked by a nation eager to move on. People came and went in the diner, but there was always the subtle feeling that Walter didn't quite belong. He had become a relic, an outdated piece of history. The world had moved forward, and with it, the respect that veterans once commanded had disappeared. His once sharp presence, the man who had stood firm under the weight of war, now seemed to blend into the background like an invisible shadow. The diner had become his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the deafening silence of his loneliness. Every Sunday, he arrived early, sitting at the same booth, waiting for his son. But even there, in the hum of the coffee machine and the quiet chatter of patrons, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer seen. People would glance at him, their eyes skimming over him like he was a piece of furniture, something that had been there too long to notice. They would talk about the weather or the latest local gossip, but not once did anyone ask about his past, about the things he had endured. Sometimes, they'd look at him with a kind of pity, as though he was a faded photograph, something from another time, irrelevant now. He had tried to ignore it, tried to make peace with the growing isolation. But the truth stung. The world had turned its back on men like him. The war he fought, the battles he endured, had become nothing more than a distant memory. The flag he had once saluted with pride now fluttered in the wind of indifference. And then, there was his son. James. James was the one thing that kept Walter going, the one reason he showed up every Sunday to sit at the same booth. James had been his rock during the darkest times, the only person who truly understood the weight of what Walter had lost. But even James, despite his best efforts, couldn't turn back the tide of neglect that had swept across the country. He had risen through the ranks of the military, his name respected and feared in the circles where soldiers were revered. Yet, for all of his success, he still struggled to reconcile the world that had changed with the man his father had been, and the man he now was. Walter understood that James had his own life, his own responsibilities. He had his own battles to fight, ones that were far removed from the memories of the Korean War. But still, the silence between them at the diner sometimes felt like a chasm. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a distance that neither of them knew how to cross. It wasn't that they didn't love each other, of course they did, but the world they lived in had shifted in ways neither of them could fully comprehend. Walter had seen it happen. He had witnessed the changing of the guard, the fading of a generation of warriors, and the rise of a new one. The men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him had all but disappeared, either forgotten or gone, leaving only their empty chairs behind. And now, at the diner, the echoes of their laughter, their camaraderie, were nothing more than a distant hum in the background. The injustice was quiet, almost imperceptible. But it was there, lingering in the corners, in the way people treated him as if he were invisible. In the way his presence was no longer a reminder of sacrifice, but a sign of obsolescence. And though he had accepted this quiet erasure, it didn't make it any easier to bear. Every Sunday, Walter would wait, sitting at the same booth, watching the world move on without him. He would try to make conversation with the waitress, but it always felt strained. Her smiles were polite, her words perfunctory. He couldn't blame her. She was just a part of the new world, a world that had forgotten the weight of history, a world that had forgotten the price of freedom. The biker group at the counter, the loud, rowdy bunch, embodied the spirit of that world, a world where the old ways were mocked and forgotten. To them, Walter was just an old man, someone who didn't matter anymore. Their laughter had no respect for what he had endured, no understanding of the life he had lived. They weren't bad people, they were simply unaware of the sacrifices that had been made for the freedoms they now took for granted. And so, every Sunday, Walter sat alone, a man out of time, waiting for his son to show up, to share a quiet cup of coffee in a world that had left him behind. He had learned to accept it. But that didn't make it any less painful. The injustice of it all, this slow erosion of respect, this quiet forgetting of the sacrifices made by men like him, was a burden that weighed heavy on his heart. It was a wound that had never truly healed, and perhaps never would. But through it all, Walter never stopped waiting. For James. For the one person who still saw him, still remembered. And perhaps, deep down, for a world that might one day wake up and remember him, too. What no one knew, and what Walter had hoped to keep hidden, was that he had sent a text just 30 minutes earlier. A simple message, almost too mundane for anyone to notice, yet it held a quiet weight. "Same table, coffee is ready," it said. A casual note, but to James, it was more than just a reminder. It was the continuation of a ritual, one they had both come to cherish, even as the world around them seemed to change. James, now Commander James Briggs, had received the text while seated in his car outside the diner. He had been coming here for years, every Sunday, just as his father had. For as long as James could remember, this diner had been a place of solace, a place where the two of them could share something simple, coffee, conversation, a quiet moment amid the noise of the world. He had always looked forward to it, but over the years, it had started to feel like more of a duty. Not that he resented it. On the contrary, he cherished it. But with each passing year, the gap between them had grown wider, and that silence between father and son had taken root in a way that both men ignored. James had his own battles, his own burdens to carry. The demands of his career had placed him in situations that required more than just strategic thinking, they required a kind of emotional detachment, a distance that made even family feel like a foreign land. The weight of command, the endless decisions, had slowly chipped away at the bond between them. But today would be different. When James entered the diner, his eyes immediately found his father at the booth. And just as he was about to wave, he saw the group of bikers, a loud, brash bunch at the counter. One of them had just shoved Walter's table, sending the coffee spilling, and a split second later, the loud smack of a slap rang through the air. James froze. His military training kicked in before his mind could process what he'd seen. His body moved automatically, stepping forward with the kind of precision he'd honed during years in service. His jaw tightened as his gaze locked onto the biker who had delivered the slap. The room fell silent, all eyes now focused on the unfolding scene. Walter hadn't moved. He hadn't retaliated. His hand, steady despite the sudden violence, had reached for his cap, placing it back on his head. But the damage was done. It was no longer just a small altercation between strangers. It was something more. A betrayal of something James knew deeply, something that he had always believed was sacred, respect. James took a step forward, eyes narrowing as he sized up the situation. He wasn't looking at the biker anymore. He wasn't even looking at the group of rowdy men who had laughed when the slap landed. His gaze had shifted to the room around him, the patrons who had watched in silence. None had stepped in. None had stood up for Walter. In the silence, a deeper truth was revealed. This was a reflection of the world that had left men like his father behind. And that anger, long buried, began to rise. He didn't need to speak. His very presence, the calm authority of a man who had commanded soldiers into dangerous situations, sent a ripple through the room. The faint clink of silverware stopped. Conversations faltered. The sound of boots on linoleum grew louder, and James soldiers, all veterans in their own right, followed him into the diner. They had come as they always did, silent, precise, a wall of discipline and respect. James locked eyes with the biker who had been the catalyst for the tension. The young man, still swaggering, still enjoying his moment of power, faltered for just a split second when he realized who stood before him. "Who touched this man?" James' voice cut through the air, cold and clear. There was no question in his tone, no room for negotiation. The biker hesitated, looking around at his friends, unsure how to react. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The other patrons watched, some in confusion, others in shame. No one had come to Walter's defense until now, and the contrast was striking. James Briggs didn't raise his voice, but his presence filled the space. His soldiers, a dozen strong, stood at attention behind him. They were dressed in combat fatigues, their faces stern, their posture impeccable. Every one of them was a man who had faced the worst the world could throw at them and had survived. But none of them were prepared for this, the need to confront the kind of disrespect that had been allowed to fester in silence for so long. The biker slowly backed away from Walter's table, his bravado slipping away like water running through fingers. He glanced nervously around the room, unsure of how to handle the sudden shift in power. But it wasn't just the biker who had changed. The room had changed. The silent witnesses had become active participants, now aware of their own complicity in allowing such things to happen. They had allowed Walter to be humiliated, to be ignored, because it was easier to turn away than to stand up for what was right. James' eyes never left the biker's face. "You slap him?" he asked, his voice now carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "For what? For being in your way?" He was speaking directly to the young man, but his words rang out to the rest of the room. To the waitress who had avoided eye contact, to the man in the corner booth who had silently sipped his coffee. It was a call to action, a challenge to each of them. The biker stammered, his arrogance cracking under the intensity of James' gaze. I didn't mean no harm, man. It's just, he was in my way, and that gives you the right to strike an old man?" James interrupted, his tone unwavering. "You have no idea who he is, do you?" The biker hesitated. The noise from the other bikers had died down. They were now watching, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. The biker stood still, his mouth working, but no words came out. He had no defense. He had no excuse for what he had done. And in that silence, Walter, sitting at the booth, just watched. The doors to the diner swung open with sudden force. Engines rumbled outside, their roar cutting through the tension inside. Tires screeched in unison, a deep, guttural sound that signaled the arrival of something far more serious than the noise of the bikers. The air shifted as boots hit the ground, one by one, each step measured and deliberate. Those sitting by the windows shifted uneasily, the familiar hum of conversation fading into silence. It wasn't just the bikers who stood still now. The whole diner seemed to hold its breath. 12 soldiers in full combat fatigues entered, moving with silent precision. Their uniforms were pressed, their boots polished, their posture perfect. They carried the unmistakable aura of those who had seen war and understood its costs. But it wasn't the uniform that commanded attention, it was the quiet authority that each soldier exuded, the way they moved with purpose, as if they were part of a singular force, a unified presence. At the center of the group was James Briggs, his eyes scanning the room as he stepped forward. There was no need for words. His presence spoke volumes. The small diner, which had once felt like a space of anonymity, now seemed to shrink under the weight of the men who filled it. The air, thick with discomfort and anticipation, hummed with the force of respect. James' gaze locked onto the biker, who had turned white, his earlier bravado vanishing in an instant. The biker, once full of swagger and mockery, now found himself staring at a man who had the weight of generations behind him. The laughter from the biker group had faltered into nervous glances as they realized, too late, that they had crossed a line that would not be overlooked. James stood tall, his shoulders squared, his eyes unwavering. "Who touched this man?" he asked, his voice low but sharp, slicing through the room like a well-aimed strike. The question wasn't just for the biker. It was for everyone who had allowed this to happen. For everyone who had remained silent. His words rang out like an echo, a challenge to those who had watched but done nothing. The room, which had once been filled with the clink of silverware and idle chatter, now stood still, frozen. The atmosphere, thick with tension, was pierced only by the faintest hum of the fluorescent lights above. All eyes were on James, his every movement commanding attention, as he stepped closer to the biker who had dared to slap his father. James didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone demanded respect. The soldiers behind him, standing at perfect attention, seemed to mirror his every movement. In a way, they were all the same man. Brothers in arms. Veterans who had fought for something greater than themselves, a bond forged in the fires of war and now playing out in this quiet diner, at this very moment. The biker's face turned red, and he took an instinctive step back, his mouth working to find an excuse, a way to regain control. But nothing came. The words he had once been so quick to throw at Walter now escaped him. His swagger was gone, replaced with uncertainty and fear. "Tell me," James continued, his voice calm but firm. "What gave you the right to strike him?" He was speaking directly to the biker now, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of man hits an old man for no reason?" The biker stammered, but his words were tangled in confusion. He tried to speak, but the words didn't form. The power he had once felt from his own actions, the sense of superiority that had come from bullying an elderly man, had evaporated like smoke in the air. His bravado had been shattered, not just by the force of James' presence, but by the realization of the man Walter truly was. The soldiers behind James stood as one, their posture a silent rebuke to the biker, to the world that had allowed this kind of behavior to fester. They didn't need to speak. Their eyes said it all. They were men who had faced much worse than this, who had fought for lives far more important than their own. They were the silent defenders of the forgotten, the men who would never let this kind of disrespect stand unchallenged. James turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the room. Every patron, every person who had watched Walter be humiliated without lifting a finger, was now under his gaze. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to demand anything. His presence, the quiet authority he had carried with him all his life, was enough. He looked down at the biker, who was now visibly shrinking under his gaze. "You slapped him," James said, his voice still low but laden with weight. "For standing in your way. For existing. For being someone you didn't even know." The biker, now silent, began to stammer out an apology, but it was too little, too late. The damage had been done. But what James did next was something that would leave an imprint on the room forever. Without taking his eyes off the man, James snapped his fingers. One of the soldiers stepped forward, not with a weapon, but with a simple gesture. In his hands, he held a fresh cup of coffee, exactly how Walter liked it. The soldier, a man whose face bore the hardened expression of someone who had seen too much, set the cup carefully in front of Walter, who hadn't moved from his booth. The act was simple, almost too mundane to register at first. But to Walter, it was everything. It was an acknowledgement of his existence, of his worth. It was a gesture that carried far more meaning than any apology could. Walter's hands, though slightly trembling, reached for the cup. He didn't speak, didn't look up, but the slight nod of his head was enough. It was a moment of silent restoration, an act of recognition that spoke louder than any words could have. The room, still thick with tension, seemed to shift. There was no grand resolution, no shouting, no battle won in the traditional sense. But in that small, quiet act, a deeper kind of justice was delivered. And as Walter took his first sip, the silence that had once dominated the diner was finally broken. The biker, now aware of the full weight of his actions, sat down, his face flushed with shame. The room had shifted. The balance had changed. And for the first time in years, Walter felt seen. Not as a forgotten old man, but as the soldier he had once been. And as the father he still was. The soldiers stood in formation behind James, their silent presence a tribute not just to the man they had served alongside, but to the one who had earned their respect long ago. Even the waitress, who had watched the scene unfold in stunned silence, now came forward. She placed a hand gently on Walter's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her words almost lost in the weight of the moment. And in the quiet aftermath, the diner filled with the sound of one final, gentle applause. It wasn't just for Walter, though. It wasn't even for James or the soldiers. It was for all the things that had been left unsaid, for the recognition that had been long overdue. For the quiet dignity that had remained unwavering, even in the face of neglect. For the men and women who, like Walter, had given everything, and were finally remembered. James didn't need to shout. He didn't need to escalate the situation further. His soldiers, standing at attention behind him, were the embodiment of discipline and respect, their silence speaking volumes. Each of them, in their own way, had been shaped by experiences that Walter could never forget. Each had fought battles both seen and unseen, carried burdens that only those who had served truly understood. Together, they formed a wall of recognition, a silent but unyielding tribute to the man who had once led them, who had carried them in spirit through his own unspoken sacrifice. James stepped closer to the biker, who, still seated, seemed to shrink with every passing second. His earlier confidence had dissolved, his body language crumpling under the weight of the moment. It wasn't the soldiers, nor the tension that had broken him, it was the presence of a legacy that was older than any of them. It was the weight of honor, of shared sacrifice, that stood before him, unyielding and unstoppable. "Let me tell you about this man," James began, his voice clear but devoid of anger. He wasn't shouting or demanding apologies. His words, calm and deliberate, had far more impact than any outburst could have. "This man, my father, is a hero in ways that you'll never understand. He jumped from helicopters into enemy fire to save lives, my life, among others. He carried the dead and the dying from the battlefield, often with nothing more than the strength of his will. He missed my birth because he was somewhere, on foreign soil, saving lives." The room was silent now, the words hanging in the air like a heavy truth. Walter sat at the booth, his posture still as straight as it had been in his youth, but his hands, though steady, were now clenched around the coffee cup. He had always believed that the sacrifices he had made, the things he had endured, were meant to be left behind, to fade into the past with the battles he had fought. But today, his son had done what he could not. He had spoken the truth that was often ignored, that was forgotten by the world but never forgotten by those who had lived it. James turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the rest of the room. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence, his words, had done what they needed to do. The room had transformed. The bikers, who had once sneered at Walter with disdain, now looked away, their faces flushed with shame. They had wanted nothing more than to harass an old man, to feel powerful for just a moment. But now, they realized the weight of what they had done, the insignificance of their bravado in the face of true strength. James stepped closer to the biker who had struck his father. The man, who had once stood tall, now appeared small and crumpled, his arrogance gone, replaced by the dawning realization of his mistake. "You slapped him, for what? For standing in your way? For daring to exist in your world?" James continued, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. The biker opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He looked down, his face reddened, his posture slumped in defeat. He had wanted to break an old man. Instead, he had broken himself, and in the process, had shattered the illusion that he had ever held power. Walter, who had been silent through it all, now raised his head slightly. His eyes, aged and weathered, met the biker's for the first time since the slap. In that brief moment, the room seemed to pause again. The biker looked into the eyes of the man he had humiliated, and for the first time, he saw not the frail old man at the table, but the soldier who had carried the weight of a war, the father who had carried the weight of a family, the man who had earned every bit of dignity he now held. "I didn't ask for your respect," Walter's voice, though soft, was clear. "I earned it. And you still have a long way to go before you understand that." The words were not harsh, nor were they filled with anger. They were a statement of truth, something that had never been demanded but was always earned through action, through sacrifice. And in that moment, the room understood what respect truly meant. It wasn't about accolades or public recognition. It wasn't about loud declarations or grand gestures. It was about quiet dignity, earned through the weight of years, through the blood, sweat, and tears of those who had given everything for something greater than themselves. James turned to one of his soldiers, who stepped forward with the fresh cup of coffee that had been delivered to Walter earlier. He placed the cup in front of Walter once more. It was not an apology. It was not a grand gesture. It was simply a moment of restoration, a simple act to remind the world that some things could not be taken away, dignity, respect, and honor were not granted by others. They were earned and kept by those who had the strength to hold on to them, no matter how the world tried to forget. As James took a step back, the soldiers behind him remained at attention. They didn't speak, but their presence said everything. They stood as a wall of strength, a reminder that the world had not forgotten the sacrifices of those who had come before them. And though the world might forget, the men and women who had served, who had fought, would always remember. The room seemed to exhale as the silence hung in the air. The soldiers, the patrons, even the waitress, all stood in quiet recognition of what had just transpired. It was not just about Walter anymore. It was about something larger, something that transcended this small diner. It was about the quiet restoration of dignity, of the acknowledgement that the past, though fading in the world's memory, would never fade in the hearts of those who had lived it. And in that moment, the diner, once a place of forgotten things, became a place of memory, a place where the past had not only been acknowledged but honored. The world could continue to move on, could continue to forget, but Walter Briggs had been restored. His legacy, though silent and unseen by most, was now standing in full view. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible anymore. The diner was filled with the sound of one last quiet, respectful applause. It was for a man who had given everything, who had sacrificed it all, and had only asked for one thing in return, to be remembered. And now, in the quiet of the diner, he had been never forgotten.